Welcome to the Roots of the Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Spirit Taufik. I'm a social justice passionista and daughter of the civil rights movement. This podcast is my commitment to serve as an intergenerational bridge and galvanize change by having honest conversations about identity, the social construct of race, racism, and social justice. Welcome to Roots of the Spirit. Hello, my dear, lovely, amazing Roots of the Spirit community and supporters. I'm so glad to be back with you for yet another episode of the podcast. There's been quite a bit that has happened in my life between the last episode and this one. In a couple weeks, I'll be turning 40. 40. I'm in a state of disbelief. However, I'm going to dedicate an entire episode to my reflections over the last 4 decades. Although there have been some really exciting, powerful, moving events and moments in my life that I would love to share with you, lessons learned, insights, I'm going to save it for a solo episode coming up within the next few episodes. But today we'll focus solely on our wonderful guest, Naomi Gracechild. Naomi is a self-identified Jill of all skills, and her life practices include multi-disciplinary artist, musician, performer, facilitator, educator, entrepreneur, social justice activist, and worshiper of nature. As the founder of Euphony Works, Naomi brings her cross-sector experience in both urban and rural communities to help clients gain a deeper understanding of socio-political dynamics in order to effectively address issues of inequity. Naomi is a working musician and music educator and continues to be an active advocate for community building and empowerment through the arts. She is currently working on a collaborative art and music show that will exhibit during Black History Month 2020 and performs regularly singing with her band Naomi Grace. Her emerging side hustle in progress, Melanin Rising, is a line of apparel and an online community supporting racialized musicians and arousing allyship and accomplishment. It's my pleasure to welcome Naomi Gracechild to the podcast.
Naomi, thank you so much for joining me on the Roots of the Spirit podcast. I'm super excited to have a conversation with you today.
I'm really honored. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I'm stoked.
I was really excited when we became acquainted, which is fairly recently, because through our Facebook connection, I've realized that we have so many serendipitous connections. I found out you lived in Ottawa, where I lived for 8 years. We have mutual friends, like a whole community in Nelson, British Columbia. And there are a few other connections. Actually, I would like to tell the story of how we became connected in the first place, because to my understanding, we kind of met through my sisters, Layla Starr, and my mother, Minnie Jean, because you attended an event at their farm in Vancouver. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. That was back in the beginning of September or end of August.
Cool. Do you mind giving me a snapshot overview? Because after your convening, I had like a 3-way call with my family. We always do that. They were really excited. They thought it was like a really, really awesome gathering of wonderful people, such a wide range of awesome people from that area. I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So, it was very serendipitous. I actually said to your sister, I think it was our ancestors bringing us together. I'd known your brother for a while, and somebody recently said, "Oh, do you know who his mom is?" And I said, "No, why would I know that? Because I usually don't ask my friends about their parents." And this was in reference to the work that I've been doing with Euphony, Equity, and Inclusion. They sent me the Wikipedia article, and I said, "Whoa, she's his mom?" And then I said, "Well, I'd love to meet her at some point." And didn't hear anything back. And then a couple months later, I got a message from a friend of mine who, as far as I knew, wasn't connected, saying, "Oh, well, there's going to be this dinner and a gathering of activists in the community at Minnie Jean Brown Tricky's house." And I said, "Okay, well, this is definitely meant to be." And then so I went to a lovely dinner at her place, at her farm at Common Ground. And then I guess maybe it was a week or so later, I was doing this art series of Black women who were in the community with power words that were written on the drawings. And yeah, I think that's when I met you, is when you saw the drawing. Yeah, it was after that we connected over Facebook.
You're such an amazing artist. And
thanks.
You had sketched Minnie Jean and you wrote the words "get in good trouble," and I just thought it was really beautiful. And then I was like, "Who is she? She's super cool." And then I was like, "Wait a minute, how in the world do we have mutual friends and family in Nelson, BC, and all of those different connections? And you're like a social justice passionista, activist, freedom fighter, and all of the above." I was like, "This is too cool." So I'm really
As I said,
excited.
I'm convinced it's our ancestors that are bringing us together to do some good work.
Absolutely. As you may know, I created my Roots of the Spirit podcast as a platform to have honest conversations about identity, race, racism, and social justice. And my ultimate goal is to galvanize change with my various initiatives. And all of the work that you're doing folds so nicely into the work that I'm doing and the mission of the podcast. I am a huge proponent of understanding our past to understand where we are right now, and in order to understand where we're going. In that spirit, I would love to hear about where you were born and raised.
Well, usually when people ask me where I'm from, I follow that question with, "Do you want the list?" I moved around quite a bit. So I myself was born where I currently live, on the unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, namely the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in what is colonially referred to as Canada, and also colonially referred to as Vancouver. My mother's family was also born here on this territory. My father comes from Guyana, South America. Ancestors before that came somewhere from West Africa, but because of the transatlantic slave trade, we don't know exactly where our roots are. And as I said, I was born here. When I was 6, I moved to moved to Vernon, which is in the central part of BC, British Columbia. And I lived there till I was 13. So my mother was a nurse, my father was a social worker. When I was 11, my mother died of breast cancer, and my father decided he wanted to go back to grad school just to sort of ensure a more solidified future for the family. So then we moved out to Toronto, where I lived for 4 years. And family life wasn't a really solid family home, and I ended up leaving home when I was 16. And that's when I moved to Ottawa. Yeah, trying to do the independent thing as a kid was, I'm sure I don't really have to go into some of the challenges that I faced when I was out there. And I was there till I was 20. I used to listen to Carleton University radio station quite a bit, and there was an interview with this guy who traveled back and forth across Canada tree planting. So I said, "Oh, well, if he can do that, I can do that," never having done anything like that before in my life. So I just had this epiphany. I gave up all my worldly possessions and came back out west with a backpack on my back. And I was going to move to Vancouver, and somebody said, "Oh, well, go to Nelson. I think that you'll like it," never having been there before. Went there, stayed in a hostel. The first night I was there, I had this overwhelming feeling of home that I had never felt before, because I had my home life had been so disjointed, and there was a lot of upheaval. But I felt this real sense of home and belonging. So in the next 24 hours, I found a place, found a job, kind of set up shop, and I was there for 4 years. And I went to music school there. However, it was kind of difficult to really do anything with my music education once I finished school. So on the pursuit of money, I went to Calgary, and I was there for 7 years. I did a number of things there. So for a while, I was studying to be a sommelier. I was mainly working in the arts, so working in music education. I was working at a performing arts school and working at a keyboard museum, leading field trips and leading and developing educational programs for elementary school students. But yeah, I always felt that I was in Calgary on a business trip, and I really lived, like my real home was in BC. So after 7 years, I moved back, and I moved to Nelson, and I was there for 4 years. And I just knew that I needed something bigger, and it was really difficult being in Nelson. So the culture there aren't very many people of color there, and a handful of Black folks there, and I really did feel disconnected from a cultural community of folks with my shared lived experience. I guess I ended up, that's one of the main reasons I ended up coming back to Vancouver. So it was sort of a loop. I mean, it was an oddly shaped loop. Started here, and now I'm right back where I started. And the funny thing is that being here now, I have connected with people from those various stages of my journey, and we're all living within the same general vicinity. I mean, like, I can walk to these folks' houses, like people who I've known in the various eras and stages of my life. So yeah, I really feel that I am where I need to be right now, and doing the work that I need to do. And I feel like I'm just kind of starting this journey of really doing my life's work kind of later on in my life, later than most people. But yeah, it's things over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of serendipity and a lot of things that seem like coincidence, but I know from my experience that when those things happen, it means I'm on the right track. Yeah, that was sort of a long-winded answer to a short question, but that's my journey in a nutshell.
Like you said, it sounds like coincidence, but I can feel the energy of just how things just show up, and like how we manifest people and our path right before us in our lives. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would like to go back. I want to talk about your journey as it relates to your identity and what it was like growing up in Vancouver. We'll start there.
Sure. So I'm biracial, identify as Black. That's the way I show up in the world. That's the way I move through the world, is as a Black woman. I lived in Vancouver until like halfway through grade 1 was when I moved to Vernon. So my younger years, my memories of that time is pretty limited, and also most of my memories are about my home life, my family life at that age. Moving to Vernon, living in Vernon as a Black kid in the 80s, and the only Black kid in my school, and one of a very, a small handful in the city. Yeah, it was. There was a lot of violence that I had to navigate. I remember the first time coming home having heard the N-word. It was about, I think it was my third day of school after starting at the new school. Somebody had told a racist joke, a grade 1, 6-year-old. So, I mean, obviously they had to have heard it from their parents. And I didn't really know what it meant. And I remember going home and asking my parents. And then that's when sort of the concerns about how things were going to be in school for me were like, that's when the concerns at home kind of started with how I was going to be able to navigate the school there. I mean, there were things like that, but then there were also things like packs of kids chasing me on bikes and throwing rocks. I remember growing up feeling ugly. I always wanted to have blonde hair and blue eyes, like my friends, because I thought that's what was normal. Also, I mean, I remember things like people treating my father really differently, but me not really having a context as to why as a young kid. I mean, as I grew older, things started to make sense, but then just, I guess, subconsciously making that association that, looking like my dad or being like my dad was a bad thing and was wrong. Feeling that like I was dirty. I remember my mom she made me a wig out of yellow yarn to try to show me how ridiculous it would look like how ridiculous it would look if I had blonde hair. But I remember putting the wig on and then just thinking that, oh, wow, I was beautiful. And I grew up with this feeling of ugliness and otherness. It wasn't until like, I guess in my mid-20s when I started to really deconstruct it. And even now in my late 30s, there's still internalized racism that I'm unpacking and working through myself. But I really, growing up in Vernon was definitely, there were some things that were great about being there. I was living in a fairly rural area, so behind my back fence was just fields. So we would just go out to play and, be out in nature, like, eating dirt and doing the things that health, what I think is healthy things for kids to do. I mean, I knew about apples. I knew about the life cycles of salmon. I mean, these are things that I'm very grateful for, is growing up having a real reverence for nature and closeness and understanding how my own natural rhythms work with the rhythms of nature. And now living in the city, I definitely feel divorced from that, which is a challenge for me. But there were pros and cons. I mean, as a racialized person, I definitely embedded some things in me that are now difficult to deconstruct. But at the same time, those things, having those experiences gives me context in doing my work now, because I see some of the same garbage that happened to me when I was a kid. It's still continuing. And even though, it's 30 some odd years later, not really that much has changed. And I think that my lived experience gives me, I'm now able to take those hardships, and now it's fuel for the work that I do.
I identify with a lot of what you have expressed.
Hmm.
And it is incredibly unfortunate that, like you said, decades have passed and young people are still dealing with that level of racism and violence. And,
Hmm.
and did you find a difference between your experience versus Ottawa? The serendipity continues to roll out. But just growing up in a rural setting, like we grew up on a farm, and then we moved to a little bit of a bigger town, and then a bigger town, and then we moved to Ottawa. And for me personally, I was experiencing racial discrimination and bullying. However, it was Ottawa was like an oasis to me because it was so multicultural that I feel great in this environment. And I'm wondering what your experience was.
My experience was a little bit different. I mean, I moved from Vernon to Toronto, which is like a huge difference. Toronto being probably the most multicultural city in Canada, and we were also living in a community that was a lot of new Canadians, and having a biracial identity and being in Vernon and always like kind of viewing myself as Black and working through identifying with the world as being Black, and then moving to Toronto when I was 13. That idea of identity, which to me had been binary up to that point, became much more complex. In a way, I guess I never really questioned my racial identity and what that meant when I lived in a predominantly white community. But then when I was in a very multicultural community, that's when I guess those identities became more complex. And I felt that like the Afro-Caribbean kids is mostly Jamaican in the community where I lived. I didn't fit in with them, but I also didn't fit in with the white kids either. So I never felt like I was on the cusp of something or on the border of something until then. And the question of are you Black enough? That's when that really arose, and that was a new thing. That was a new thing for me. Whereas like the names and things that I had been called in when I lived in Vernon, when I moved to Toronto, it turned to Whitey and Oreo and things like that, which was a new kind of idea for me to navigate, I guess. And like, so it brought an extra an extra layer of complexity to what that meant. Moving to Ottawa for me was a little bit different because there were different parts of my identity that I was exploring. One of the facets I identify as queer as well, so that was, I guess, the facet of my identity that I was exploring and discovering when I moved to Ottawa, and that really had to do with the community of folks as well that I had surrounded myself with when I was there. So Ottawa I wouldn't say was an oasis to me, and neither was Toronto. I've never really found. I guess I didn't really find that place yet where I would see it as an oasis where I can really like just be. Other than I'd say maybe here where I am right now, but I don't know if that's locational or if that just has to do with the age and stage I am right now in my life.
Yeah, I totally feel you on that. It's interesting. Now you have me thinking about my own experience because oasis might be too much of a strong way of putting it. I guess you could say it was kind of like the polar opposite of what I had experienced. I was like, finally, I can breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't like, I mean, there were 2 years of incessant harassment. So it took a while, but it was within the refugee and immigrant community that I found kinship and friendships and a shared experience, interestingly enough. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I feel like I can relate to you also as you're speaking about just kind of you're getting bullied or harassed and discriminated against, and violence is being projected onto you from white people. And then comes a point where now the Black part of your identity is in question. And so like just having to navigate that is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, just your stage and place in life. I'll say for me personally, the sense that I get from the narrative of women who I surround myself with, there's a language now that we didn't have growing up because we're around the same age. Looking at the work that you do and also how language plays a role and how the conversation and narrative can either help or hinder. What was the narrative and language doing at that time for you? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm just taking a moment to really let that sink in and reflect because I have a lot I have a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts on that. And I want to answer without getting too ranty. Um,
No, please, this is the forum.
oh, this is the rant space. Okay, well, I'm in the right place then because
Keep it real. Let's do truth telling. Like, this is, it's so funny. I had a conversation yesterday, and people will send me emails like providing overviews about how their identity has shaped their entire life experience. So I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend, and I was saying, no, we need a space. We need a space, and this is the space.
Mhm. Language. Language is one of the yeah, language is important and language is always evolving. So I guess one of my biggest concerns about the language sometimes it's used to discuss identity and also the language that is used in the equity and inclusion space is it's not very inclusive and it's not accessible to a lot of people. I think that there's a lot of emphasis on what is the right thing to say and the wrong thing to say, what is the proper language to use, and kind of having a hard line on that rather than really embracing the evolution of language. Because language, maybe I'll just be more blunt. I find that sometimes the vernacular that is in the language, the vocabulary that is used in the social justice space is polarizing, and that it can exclude people who don't necessarily understand. Like I met somebody recently who didn't know the term person of color, and they were a person of color. And so they never really felt that they were able to take part in those conversations, so they didn't think that it had to do with them. They just didn't know. I had somebody a little while ago recently too who was organizing an event that was like a forum to talk about poverty in for racialized queer trans folks in Vancouver, and they used the term BIPOC on the flyer. But the thing is, a bunch of folks showed up who were not BIPOC folks or who were not Black and Indigenous people of color because they didn't know what the term meant, and because of the kinds of dynamics that sometimes happen in those spaces, the whole conversation ended up having to do with centering their experiences and their feelings rather than anyway, I don't know what the answer is, because I think that it's really necessary that we do use explicit language when we're talking about these things so we understand. But I think that when we get so wrapped up in the language more than the meaning of what we're talking about, it can also be dangerous. Did that make sense? I feel like I kind of was like a little bit roundabout there.
No, absolutely. It makes so much sense. And you have me thinking about a variety of different things. And one is just the word mixed is something that, I grew up gravitating toward. As a young person, it seemed like something that was empowering. And then as I got older, that changed because I felt like, I was like, wait a minute, did I choose this or someone chose it for me?
Mm-hmm.
And like there was just kind of an evolution of the way I self-describe. But ironically, my whole entire life experience has been shaped by the fact that people are constantly intrigued by my identity. And I say that to say that the language has been something that I've been in tune with and has evolved in front of my eyes. And on the flip side, doing anti-racism work and having just read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah, with that book, he's very clear, and there's an explanation. So I mean, there were things that like before reading that book, I did not know, but now I know because he took the time to explain it rather than judging. Like it wasn't an interaction where I was being judged on my intention because I used a term rather than like giving me space to have a dialogue and explain.
That's really interesting because I had a Roots of the Spirit book club and we read How to Be an Anti-Racist. Quite a few people in the book club had similar sentiments. They felt like a couple people said this is the first time that they felt like they could read and receive and digest the information without feeling, one of the words was defensive.
Yep.
Another word was stupid. And so it's interesting because it's like, how do we create spaces that actually get at the heart of how we truly have been raised, where we come from, our identities, how we actually feel. So we can assess the problem and work from there, because if we're constantly moving around like putting on a representative of what we think we should be saying and speaking, then we're not getting to the heart of the ills.
I think one of the functions of capitalist white supremacist patriarchy is separating us and making it so that we don't have conversations. There was somebody, I don't remember who it was. I'll see if I can find the title of the book and send it to you afterwards. But sorry, the author of the book. It's called Brave Spaces, from Safe Spaces to Brave Spaces, or something like that. So this person talks about, the idea of safe spaces can sometimes evolve to mean that, like, there are certain things that we cannot talk about and certain things that we cannot say. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that does serve a function, but I think that it also there are conversations that need to be had. Like, we have been discouraged from having these conversations for a really long time. These things about conversations about race, conversations about gender. These conversations have been taboo, because when we actually do come together and start to talk about these things, it disrupts the status quo, mm-hmm. and it disrupts the stronghold that capitalist white supremacist patriarchy has on us. So by creating spaces that are so safe so that there's no disruption, actually, in my opinion, has the opposite effect that I think that the opposite thing that we really need as a human family to move forward. When I talk about the serendipity that's happened in my life, I can also honestly look back and say that the times in my life where I've had the most discomfort and I've had the most, I don't know, I'd say like trials and tribulations and things that in the moment seem like they're negative and seem like they're bad, I've learned the deepest and richest lessons that have given me the fuel to move forward and to really walk more strong on my path. I don't like using that term, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because I think that almost like, gives license for suffering. That's not really what I mean. I just mean that, like, in the darkest times, that is like really the beginning of when the light comes. So I think that moving, like, as a collective human family, moving through these difficult conversations and these difficult topics is exactly what we need to continue to evolve and move to the next stage of humanity. I think that, like, right now with all I think it'll be easy to look around and see, think that we're seeing the end, and we're at, in many ways we're at like a really dark time. But I really think that we're just seeing we're hearing the death rattle of the old regime, and things are difficult right now is because we're actually like at the beginning of moving into a new stage of humanity, and it's beautiful. I'm feeling really optimistic.
And I have to say, as difficult as it has been for me to tap into my higher self and consciousness to truly believe that, I do believe, like in the United States, and I'm interested your perspective, because I mean, we're all dealing with the same thing no matter where we are right now. Like, the world is feeling the rumblings. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there is a lot to be said about exposing what has been underneath for so long. Mm-hmm. I started doing this work in early 2000. People thought I was crazy. They're like, can you stop? Like, racism is a thing of the past. Mm-hmm. So what was your journey like from the experience that you had, as you described it, some of the darkest times, giving you a lot of meaning and profound understanding? Do you feel as though some of the pain that you experienced was preparing you for your purpose?
100%. But if you were to ask me that, I can say that now because I feel like I'm in a really good space in my life. Like, at this day, I'm like in one of the most one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Like, there's sunshine streaming through my window. I'm here talking to you, sitting like, the comfy sweatpants, having a beautiful cup of tea. I'm feeling pretty good. So it's easy for me to like sit here and say that now. But if you were to ask me those same questions when I was in the thick of it, I probably wouldn't have had the same answer. I mean, in retrospect, it's we can always assign meaning to what's happened. So I don't know 100% if that's like, I mean, I don't know for sure if that's, that's what it was doing, but like I do, because now now looking back, I can contextualize what happened. And I mean, I think a lot of what got that, I mean, this is maybe jumping to a slightly different topic, but a lot of what got me through that was my art and my art and creativity, and the intersections between art and spirituality. I mean, that's, to me, like, that thing is, that's alchemy. That's where we can choose to whether we want to transmit the difficult times, the difficult things that we've navigated, and transmit that energy, or transform it. And I think that art and spirituality, or art is the I guess the main catalyst for me that's helped me to transform that. So so your question was, do I think that the things that I went through prepare me for my life's work? I think that without having gone through those things, I wouldn't have as deep of an understanding and a context, and I wouldn't have the capacity for as much of a capacity for compassion that I do without having those lived experiences.
Just so I'm extremely clear, I asked that question knowing what your life's work right now and your organization that you have founded, Euphony Equity and Inclusion Works. So I'm looking at it also from this vantage point. So I just want to articulate that I asked that question with that knowing and with the utmost respect, because I don't want to ask that question and a young person listening, experiencing very difficult times, being discriminated against, to look at that and look at me or your experience and say, oh, okay, well, maybe this is preparing me. Do you know what I'm saying? I just want to put it out there that I am fully aware of what you're doing right now. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense, because I want to make sure that it's only from this vantage point and looking at it in the rear view that I can ask that question.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And I think that and I want to say too that the discrimination and things like that I've experienced that has fueled me to do the work that I'm doing today wasn't just relegated to childhood. This is stuff that's actually that I'm still navigating in my life, and I'm still moving through in certain situations, like in professional situations, in interpersonal relationships. So I mean, it's not that okay, I went through it and now it's done. No, I still have to navigate these things on a daily basis. That being said, I think that there's something to be said for feeling your feelings when you're in that, trying to push back and try to push down the grief in the morning and things like that you go through when you that you experience when you have hardship, trying to push it down and be tough. I think that was probably the biggest source of my own suffering, was denying my own emotional processes. These things need to come out now. As I've found and I've discovered and developed ways and spaces where I can safely and with dignity move through my emotional processes. Nobody is a superhuman. I mean, the people who you see who seem to be hard and tough and that nothing phases them, in my experience, are the people who need the most nurturing. So yeah, I guess I'm saying that in response to your thought about young people listening, and yeah, honor your own feelings. If you feel sad, feel sad. Don't try to, you don't have to be tough. If you're feeling afraid, it's okay. All these emotions are normal human processes, and we have to move through. You can't get that. I went to summer camp. There was a camp song. I don't remember what the whole song was. It's you can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it. You got to go through it. And that's the same with emotional processes. I mean, there are certain medicines that are available that can help us to move through them more freely, but we still have to move through them. When I say medicines, I mean things like art and music, and spending time in nature, being around people who love you. I mean, all these things are things that can help us move through, but we do have to move through in order to move on to the next phase.
Can you tell me about your journey as a musician, as an artist, and how you came to found Euphony Equity and Inclusion Works? Sure.
Okay, so I was born into a musical family, and it's kind of interesting because I did some research. I don't know. I go down Google and Wikipedia rabbit holes sometimes, 2:00 in the morning, and this one night I started just researching my family last names, and there's a lot of so my family last name is Cromwell. I recently changed my last name because hasn't been my family name and many times removed. There's been a number of reasons why my family name is Cromwell, but they weren't. Maybe that's another story for another time. But basically, somebody a few generations back changed their name to Cromwell, and then prior to that, the name that was given to my family was due to colonialism and slavery. On my father's side, I'm talking about, and even on my mother's side, when my mother's family immigrated to this part of the world, they were given a last name that wasn't their ancestral name. So because of that, I've chosen my own last name, Gracechild, and that has to do with like the patterns and like all the things, the hardships that my ancestors went through to bring me here and where I am in my life right now. It was grace that really allowed my ancestors and allowed me to survive. So I'm the child of grace, which is why I've chosen the last name Gracechild for myself. But anyway, you're asking about the journey of musicians. So when I was doing that research, I found out that many of my ancestors were musicians and artists as well. So it's something that like I was born into. People ask, oh, when did you first start singing? Well, I don't remember because it's always just been a part of my life. I remember like as a kid taking road trips, my mother would teach my brother and I how to sing in 3-part harmony when we were on road trips. And like, I've always kind of just known how to do that. Formal music education was mandatory in my family. And also like the whole Eurocentric idea of what art was definitely instilled into my father. So we learned classical music. My brother is a classical viola player and I learned classical piano and then was singing in classical choirs. I rejected classical piano. I hated it. I hated it. And I put it down when I was 13 and I moved to theater instead. But when I was 19, I just gravitated back to it because again, it's like, it is who I am. It's not something that I chose. It's something I really feel it's something that I was just like, it's just what I was born into. So after I went to music school in Nelson, and then following that, I went on to start teaching music. And as I mentioned before, I was doing a school program, so leading field trips. And one of the things that I definitely noticed was the appropriative nature of the way that certain musical concepts were described in music education, and the idea of what was right and what was a proper way to learn music. And when I started, I guess, like making note of that and calling that out, I got a lot of pushback. Also, leading school trips, I noticed that how racialized students, and these I'm talking about kids like 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, were being treated by teachers. And again, when I started to like call that out when I started to call it out to my coworkers and my supervisors, I definitely got the pushback. And then I started looking around and noticed, oh, I am the only racialized person in this space. So I guess that's kind of when the light turned on for me. And then I said, okay, and then it became important for me to, as a racialized person, to make myself, to disrupt traditionally white spaces by just being present. So I started to volunteer to be to sit on boards. So I was on the board of when I moved back to Nelson, I was on the board of directors for the Nelson and District Arts, the Arts Council. Also working at the youth center down there, and really like understanding the need to disrupt these spaces. And without naming names, I was hired by an organization then to do some work this was a couple of years ago, to enhance their capacity to serve quote unquote culturally diverse communities. And under the definition of the Canada Council for the Arts, culturally diverse means basically any folks that aren't of Western European ancestry, yes, Western European descent, so non-white folks. I did about 4 months of research, and in my findings, I guess one of the things when I summarized to them, my final report was, why is it now that you want to do this work? What opportunities are present now that weren't present before? The second thing I said was, if there was opportunity in the past, why didn't you think it was a priority? And the third thing is, are you willing to disrupt the current power structure to enable true inclusion rather than tokenism? I'm paraphrasing. I was a lot more gentle in the way that I said it, but those things were incredibly challenging, and they canceled my email address. I had to fight to get paid. They got a large sum of money from grant money to be able to do this project. They gave me like a drop in the bucket and kept the rest, and basically blacklisted me from the organization.
I just had this conversation yesterday.
Well, See, exactly. So at first I took it really personally. I said, "Oh, I did a bad job," and what I was saying was way too harsh. When I didn't think it was particularly radical. I mean, these things, people have been saying these things like since W.E.B. Du Bois. This is not like, what I was saying was not particularly revolutionary, or so I thought. When I started doing research about the patterns of things that, like the cycles that happen to women of color in the nonprofit space, the more I saw, oh no, this isn't just me. This is a thing that happens. This is a thing that happens because of the nonprofit structure and how white supremacy shows up in the nonprofit world. So that was actually what inspired me to start Euphony Equity and Inclusion Works. The word euphony itself means it's the antonym or the opposite of cacophony. So cacophony is when you have a number of different sounds that are working in competition with each other that basically create noise and that are displeasing. But euphony is when you take those same sounds and then the way that they work together is beautiful and harmonious. So what it really showed to me is it's not about changing these identities or changing these sounds. It's about understanding how they can work together to create something beautiful, which to me, like, is, I see evidence of that happening in nature, with the diversity in nature. Diversity is basically what helps us to continue and evolve. So as a musician, I decided to take that idea and then having that sort of principle as sort of the guiding principle for how I do my work. But really, it was inspired. It started off by helping folks understand how dynamics can exist in the nonprofit space, but now I'm expanding to the corporate space and the for-profit world as well.
That's fantastic. So what has been your experience thus far?
Really positive. I've been pleasantly surprised by a lot of things. I'm pleasantly surprised by the folks that actually want to do the work. And before I show up, who have already done some groundwork, I see lots of evidence of things getting better and things evolving. I still get these experiences though where people get so offended by the language that they shut down. I mean, using terms like white supremacy and even the term racism, that folks get more offended by the term racism by the word racism than actual racism itself, which I've been finding that's been a big challenge. But yeah, as I said, like, a few times in this conversation, I think that we need to move through it. We have to sit through the discomfort and move through it, which is what I kind of just keep instilling in people. Trying to approach these things systemically and talking about them as systems and how we are all participating in some way or another in this system. And it's trying to take the moral judgment out of the equation. Like, you're a good person, you're a bad person. Like, you as a human being are racist. Well, rather than saying it that way, well, we are all participating in some way in a system that is a racist system.
Yeah, so I feel like How to Be an Anti-Racist really breaks that down. And for example, there were quite a few white people who were in the book club, and they received that book very, like, there was no resistance. So, like, the way that he explained it, it was like a great toolkit.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think a part of the problem. So social media is a double-edged sword. But I mean, like the sharp edge. I guess they're both sharp edges. You understand what I'm saying? But like
yeah, for sure.
One side of it is that we're having these conversations. The other side of it is that these conversations are being had through a screen and without a lot of context. So people are very reactive. Mm-hmm. And reading a book is different than having like 5-line exchanges on Twitter or Facebook. It's really easy to, when you don't have like the human element in there. I mean, when you're sitting down with somebody and having a conversation voice to voice or face to face, you're communicating on a number of different levels, not just through words. With social media, the responses are usually written in haste without a lot of thought and reflection before, or editing before they're said. Memes are like, one line, there's not a lot of context. With that book, it's, maybe an initial statement might be abrupt and might feel like jarring, but then afterwards, like, because there's time for explanation, mm-hmm. then you contextualize, then it allows the reader to contextualize a little bit. And I'm seeing like social media can be really polarizing, especially with cancel culture, not allowing time and space to have these actual interpersonal, real communication where we can honor each other's humanity in these discussions, even if our ideals are in conflict with one another. There's an element of respect that's often removed in social media interactions. Whereas with that book, I feel that the author was respecting the reader and allowing them, giving them the information they needed to be able to make their decisions.
At the end of the day, it's based on ignorance, miseducation, actually education, because the intention for the educational system is the outcome that we're getting. It was not set up to empower people of color. And so it's working just right.
Yep.
But I hear what you're saying in terms of like the quick snap gut reaction. In addition to the fact that we don't have these spaces, also there's so much trauma going on, and it's right in our face for us to see through media. So like you said, it's a blessing and a curse, just to put it in that kind of context, like a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing it for what it is and not having those spaces. So it infuses something in me. And I feel like the work that you're doing is so important, because without that, we're just reacting.
Yep.
You live in Canada. I live in the United States. I used to live in Canada. I'm born and raised in Canada. I'm actually a dual citizen. I get asked all the time what my perception of the differences between Canada and the US. Although I'm like, my family is in Vancouver, my whole entire family, immediate family, is in Canada. So I feel like I definitely have a pulse, but I don't live there day to day. I'm interested in your perception of where, I hate the word race. So I always have air quotes because we're so wrapped up in the concept, the social construct, I still use it, but race relations in Canada, like where are we?
It's a conversation that the conversation has been discouraged and has been taboo. I think that the United States is a lot further along with having the conversation, because it's very much like, it also has to do with population as well. Because I think that in Vancouver, I think it's 1.6% people of African descent, the population. So the conversation around race and racism doesn't include anti-Blackness at all. People think that doesn't exist, or is easy to dismiss it. Even though I think it was 2 years ago, the United Nations called Canada out on its anti-Blackness, and there are a lot of contributions of Canadians of African descent, and it's not talked about. So there's a lot of like Black folks here are under constant threat of erasure. Also, Canada wants to think, I think that the majority of white Canadians want to think that racism doesn't exist here, and that we are, I'm not as racist as my racist neighbors to the south. So I think that the conversation, even approaching the conversation, is an affront often to people's Canadian sensibilities, and like they don't want to approach it at all. The media doesn't report on it. There was an incident here just less than a year ago where there was a pretty violent situation with at one of the high schools here in Vancouver. A young student made a video of himself saying that he wanted to round up all of the N-words and put them in a room and throw a bomb in, and circulated it around the school. The kid was at first got a 3-day suspension, and the response was very much, oh, well, it's just kids being kids, just kids joking around. Meanwhile, the racialized students who went to that school were feeling really uncomfortable. It took a whole bunch of parents going and storming a school board meeting for them to actually take any action at all. And now the student who made the video was transferred to another school for the remainder of the school year, but is now back. So the Black students who were at that school don't feel safe and were transferred. This was a lot of folks in the Black community here were talking about it and were pushing for action, talking to the media. No, there were no actual public reports until a few weeks ago. The fact that it happened last November and it took until just now for the news to report on it,
wow.
That to me kind of speaks volumes about race relations in Canada, that people would rather pretend that it doesn't exist than confront it. And I think trying to get attention or get people to even have the conversations is a lot more difficult, because it's offensive to folks' sense of quote unquote Canadian identity. When I say folks, I mean white folks. If you ask racialized folks about racism in Canada, they'll have majority will have like a very different response. But yeah, there's a lot of white folks that I've spoken with, including folks in my own family, that say, oh, racism just doesn't exist in Canada. There's very much a colorblind kind of approach to race relations,
That's
up to and including relations with the Indigenous peoples. Things are now being, talked about more so than when I was young. But again, this is very, very recent, and also because I think it has to do with populations as well.
That's got to make your work incredibly interesting. Just the starting point, so to speak, on the conversation. We got to have a whole nother podcast for that. I have two more questions. You have created Melanin Rising, a line of apparel and online community supporting racialized musicians and arousing allyship and accomplishment. Can you talk about that?
I love statement tees, and I started just making them for myself and like taking selfies and putting them on Instagram. But I mean, the statement tees that I have are mostly like positive messages, and I find that often, like sometimes messages of activism can be like violent or militant, and I don't think that is our way forward. I think that our way forward is a heart first space, which is why so the first shirt I made said read Bell Hooks, because Bell Hooks primarily writes about love, and the perspective that she writes from is about love, about self-love, and about understanding how love and activism intersect. And I think those are really powerful messages. So yeah, the first shirt I made was read Bell Hooks, and then a bunch of people just said, oh, I want to buy one. So then I did a run of t-shirts just for friends. After that, I noticed that the people who were buying them were racialized people, but also allies and accomplices as well. Sometimes there's a question of appropriateness as to what's appropriate for whom to say in certain movements. So I wanted to create shirts that allies and accomplices can wear without the question of, is it appropriate for me to make this statement, or is it appropriate for me to wear this? Also, there is, with racialized musicians in Vancouver and having access to performance spaces, either on festival stages or in venues themselves. In certain spaces, there's some gatekeeping that happens, where basically, in order to be seen, it's almost like you need to be endorsed by white musicians or white promoters, organizers. So what I kind of wanted to do was like have the musicians themselves, because I am a musician and I am in this community, and I do face the same kind of barriers. That would be myself and my peers that are wearing these shirts on the website, so that if folks want to know what we're doing artistically, they can come directly to us rather than having to go through the gatekeepers.
Can you give a quick snapshot of where people can purchase Melanin Rising tees and where we can find you on Instagram and social media?
Sure. So Melanin Rising, right now I'm planning on launching in February during Black History Month. I'm also doing an art show with a friend of mine who's also a multi-disciplinary artist, Tanya Aganaba. And Tanya is a singer, songwriter, as well as a visual artist. So right now we're just looking for a space to host the show here in Vancouver. And the official launch of Melanin Rising will coincide with that. Right now, I'm just raising funds to get the full website up and running. Our temporary site is, and actually our site when the full launch happens, is melaninrisingapparel.com. We do have an online store, and we're raising funds through pre-sale. So there are 4 designs of shirts that are available. I have 2 different cuts of each print. They're being printed in a partnership with Trapline Designs, which is a community print shop in the downtown east side. Any shirts that you purchase between now and February are going to help to get us up and running.
Awesome. Yeah. This has been such a wonderfully informative, rich conversation. I can't thank you enough, but I do have one last question.
Sure.
Naomi, what are the roots of your spirit?
That's a deep question. That we're all one. I guess, and the older I get and the more I explore this plane of existence, the clearer that becomes to me. I feel the most connected and the most like my authentic self when I'm out in nature, because it's not that I am in nature, it's a reminder that I am nature, and that I'm a part of this moving, growing, evolving thing that I maybe don't understand, but I do on a cellular level because I am it.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much.